My name's Joel. I'm here to talk about reaching the next level of your career, moving from a senior engineer to a staff engineer. I have been a staff or principal level iOS engineer for almost 10 years, so I've got a little bit of background and context to give this talk. Here's our agenda. So we're going to talk about the difference between management and IC roles. We're going to define what exactly staff roles are. We're going to talk about how to get promoted, which is the majority of this talk. We're going to discuss whether it's worth it to do so, and then we'll wrap it all up. The terms you're going to use in this talk. An IC is an individual contributor. That is most likely you. A manager is someone who has direct reports, so that's most likely your boss. Senior is a terminal IC level, which is to say, a position from which you don't have to be promoted. Staff and beyond, on the other hand, are the IC levels that are past senior. And senior leadership is your VPs, your CTOs, your people with decision-making authority. For the purpose of this talk, when I say staff, I mean any of the staff plus roles, anything staff and beyond. And when I say VP, I mean anyone in senior leadership, the person who's closest to you on the reporting chain, who is senior and has decision-making authority. So if this meme doesn't strike a chord in your soul, you might not be as old as I am. But this is really based on a true story. This is often the way the world works. Going into management is the default way to advance your career beyond a certain point. So let's take a minute and talk about what that looks like. This is the traditional career path. So not too long ago, your choices were to either stay as a senior engineer or to go into management. And no surprise that with no option to advance, a lot of people did end up choosing management. Then the industry realized that it was turning all of its most knowledgeable engineers into managers who had to start from zero. And we started thinking about advancement as an IC. This is still not super common at smaller companies, though. So it's worth taking a minute to evaluate that path of least resistance. And it's not like management isn't rewarding. You will learn about a whole new aspect of building a team and understanding how people work together. You can satisfy your curiosity. You'll be clear on the success criteria of your new role. And you'll learn how to operate in a different area. On the other hand, if you increase your scope in your technical area, you will still learn new things. You'll get a different view on how technical decisions impact your organization. And that view will open up new challenges. And you'll continue to hone your existing skills. So before we figure out how to get to the staff level, we need to know what it is. And that's harder than it sounds. There's no industry-wide shared definition like there is for being a manager. And what there is doesn't always apply to mobile engineers. So as we see in this chart, before we get to the staff level, job roles are pretty similar. The scope expands as seniority increases, but it's basically a reactive process of delivering on a task that someone puts on your plate. This is what we're seeing in that highlighted owns row. Now, hopefully there is room to grow in influence, and a senior engineer should have a strong voice in how their team responds to challenges beyond the scope of an individual project, like architectural decisions. But again, all of that will be reactive to the problems at hand. Where the other levels are reactive, staff and beyond are proactive. Your work is no longer evaluated in terms of implementing tasks or features, but in driving impact for the business. This requires having a deep understanding of how the business operates and what the challenges are, far beyond the technical sphere. It means trying to figure out what problems are coming in order to position the company to meet them. And to the extent that the job is reactive, it's much more about communication, explaining to your company's leadership how your domain works and what limits and opportunities that domain provides. It might be clear already that this is hard when you're focused on iOS. Your business impact, your product influence, and architectural decisions are all kind of limited to the scope of iOS, or maybe the scope of mobile, which means that you're siloed out of a big chunk of your company's surface area. So you need to be creative in how you position your work. Let's step back a second and talk about the shapes that a staff role can take. There's a list of staff engineer archetypes compiled by Will Larson in his book Staff Engineer. Let's go through them. The tech lead works for their team, setting direction and foreseeing problems in a product or technical area. This is something an iOS engineer can only really do if there's an iOS or a mobile team, rather than engineers being distributed among feature teams. And if there are few enough engineers to fit on one team, it might mean that your organization isn't big enough to need a staff engineer. The architect owns the technical approach in an area that's critical to the business. This is something an iOS engineer can do only if the company considers iOS to be critical. And hopefully they do, but I've been surprised how often companies don't actually behave as if mobile matters. So a lot of talk about operating mobile first, but when push comes to shove, we can ship faster by the website. The solver figures out problems other people can't. This is the most heads down coding archetype. So in that sense, it's closest to what we're used to from the senior level. But an iOS engineer can only do this if your company has enough complex mobile specific problems to occupy someone full time, which is probably not the case if you don't work someplace like Facebook or Uber, where the company's entire product portfolio is based on mobile and it does more than just render JSON that comes from a server. The right hand represents an executive somewhere that they don't have time, space, or background to join themselves, which effectively increases their reach. This is hard for an iOS engineer to do because, by the siloed nature of our work, you probably won't have the context to solve organization sized problems outside of mobile. My takeaway from all this is that all of the standard staff archetypes are difficult for iOS engineers because of the way we tend to work in that silo. It's a silo of technology, of product, and of business needs. Often things inside the silo aren't complex enough to justify a staff engineer's full time attention, while at the same time, being in there means that you don't have enough visibility outside the silo to work on other things. In my career, I've been a tech lead and an architect, and I'm pretty convinced that those are the only two archetypes we can justify. You can be a tech lead for iOS and mobile teams in organizations arranged that way, and you can be an architect for overall mobile technical strategy in organizations that really invest in mobile. All right, here's what you came for: how to get that promotion. If you take one thing away from the talk, it's this: senior leadership is your focus. Why? Your direct manager has probably never handled a promotion at this level, but your VP certainly has. So build a relationship with them before you start going for the job. They're the key to all of this. They're the one who will decide whether you get the promotion, and they're also the one who can prepare you for the process. So bearing that in mind, there are three ways to get this done. If you're the first person at your company to make this transition, you've actually got quite a bit of latitude to define what the role means. You can use the archetypes as a jumping off point, but tailor it to the specific work that you've been doing or that you would like to do. This is a great opportunity to reframe some of your successes as qualifying you for the next level instead of starting from zero. If you feel like your track record so far is more senior than staff, you can work with your leadership to create a plan of new work that will get you there. This is where you need that pre existing relationship. This approach will take longer, but since the person helping you define the path to promotion is probably the same one who will give you the promotion, it's a pretty safe strategy. And if you don't feel supported enough by your leadership to put this in their hands, or if you don't want to wait, you can always leave. The reality is, it's almost always easier to get a promotion by moving to a new company than by staying put. So this is a real option. The trade off, of course, is you'll be leaving behind tenure, knowledge, and relationships at your old company. Trying to adapt to a new role is hard even if nothing else has changed. It gets a lot harder when you combine it with learning a new workplace. So the first strategy is to define the role yourself. Let's talk about some of the work I've been doing as a staff engineer and the lessons we can take. So I spend roughly 20% of my time doing regular development work, half of it on proactive work, and the remaining 30% on reactive work. The development work is the regular stuff you'd expect: bug fixes, features, on call shifts, and so on. Some staff engineers wouldn't do any of this kind of work, but because iOS tends to be a smaller group of engineers, it's probably going to be part of your day. So if you remember the archetypes, this points us in the direction of acting as a tech lead, someone who's responsible for the strategic direction of a team. Here are some examples of proactive work I've been doing. I'm going to give a little summary of each one of these and try and connect them back to some broader themes. QA. So we've known for a while that our ad hoc QA process wasn't scaling with our product. Having worked with QA engineers in past jobs, I knew that they had a skill set we as product engineers didn't. So I started on a long process of convincing my leadership that we needed to bring experts on board. This meant exercising skills that I would describe as engineering adjacent: collecting data on regressions and code coverage, quantifying time spent on hotfix builds, and ultimately creating a business case that I used to convince the CTO we needed help. So right off the bat, we can see how different this is from standard development work. Part of the staff job is finding those problems that no one else owns and taking responsibility for them, even if they're not code. For the open source policy, I had a piece of code that I wanted to release as an open source library. It turned out that we did not have an open source policy where I could publish the code, so I had to go on a monumental yak shaving journey. I researched open source policy at other companies, and I worked with my CTO and our legal department. The twists and turns of this process took just about a full year, mostly back and forth with legal. So, building on the previous point, not only does staff work bring you outside your coding comfort zone, the feedback cycle is potentially very long. When you're coding, you know whether your work is successful when the tests pass. But when you're developing policy, it's another story. Speaking of writing documents, I've also written a number of strategy documents for the iOS platform. These include a vision document, which describes a desired end state 5 years out, a technical investment plan, which describes how to get there, several sets of architectural guidelines, an implementation plan for adopting GraphQL, and many architecture review documents that described a proposed implementation in detail. So the theme in these bullet points continues. A big part of the job is written communication. All this work aligns most closely with the architect, who works on the approach and direction of projects in a critical area. This works because I'm at a company that is willing to invest in iOS as a critical area. Team structure is a little bit different. To set the scene, after a few reorgs, we ended up with an engineering org chart that most of the iOS engineers weren't happy with. I gathered concerns from the iOS engineers and talked to leadership to understand why the new structure was put in place. Then I came up with something new that I thought would address the concerns from both sides. So we see with this one, it's not just about being able to write documents, and it's not just about sharing information with those documents. The ultimate goal is always going to be building consensus. This is a really significant way that staff work differs from senior. When you're operating proactively rather than reactively, you have no choice but to convince people that the work you want to do is the right use of your time. And let's look at the other side of the coin: reactive work. I think this is interesting because it's still not just coding, but it is the result of other people putting things on my plate. In that sense, it's kind of a bridge between senior and staff. The big difference versus senior is that a staff engineer will usually have the latitude to decide whether work they're asked to do is a good use of their time. If you recall the chart that we looked at earlier, that's how you become accountable for business impact. When someone asks you to do work that you think won't drive impact for the business, it's incumbent on you to do the math. Back when we were a small company, our hiring process for iOS engineers was the same as for full stack engineers. When we had plans to scale up, I was asked to contribute to a new process. I came up with a coding project based on the work our iOS engineers do every day, along with some system design topics for discussion. This wasn't something I proactively developed, but in retrospect, it probably should have been. The need was clear, and the fact that it ended up on my plate means I was probably the right person to own it. In this project, we see some of the same themes. There's work that's coding adjacent, but not coding, and there's a need to do a lot of writing, socializing, and consensus building to arrive at a solution. We can add a theme too, a poorly defined but important problem. It's difficult to make headway on a project like this without understanding the goals of the company. That's necessary context to turn a vague problem like fix hiring into actionable steps. I was asked to head up a team that was charged with creating a blue sky iPhone app for a new business area. The work on this project was split squarely between the architect and the tech lead archetypes. I was engaged in the technical work of a team's area of responsibility, and I defined the approach and direction for the code base and the architecture. And this was not a well-defined problem either, because a brand new code base encourages all sorts of flights of fancy and castles in the sky. So my job here was to lean on my experience and determine what we could borrow from work we'd done in our main apps code base and where we should try something new. When you multiply that out over the number of decisions you have to make in an app architecture, it turns into quite a big problem. And on the theme of slow feedback loops, we really won't know which of those calls were right for months or even years as the codebase organically grows around the scaffold that those decisions create. So this is a staff engineer's workload, or at least one staff engineer's workload. If you can make the case that your time breaks down like this, and that you're doing the kind of work I talked about, you're probably in a good place to build a definition of the role around your current job. Let's recap. So if you're not just coding, it means that you're thinking about the things that enable you and your colleagues to write better code more efficiently. If you're writing for communication and understanding, you're sharing that thinking with an audience that consists of not just your peers, but also the people up the chain from you who have decision-making authority. And if you're building consensus, that means your writing is convincing those people up the chain that your thinking is correct. And if you're turning poorly defined problems into solutions, it means you're finding ways to take action on those convincing ideas. Moving on to the second strategy, working with your VP. If your work is more weighted to the senior level, or if your company already has a well-defined staff role that your work doesn't fall into very well, it's time to talk to your VP and make it their problem. So your goal now is to get yourself into the previous category, where your work matches their expectations for the role, and you're in a position to sell it. That means you're going to have to take on some new responsibilities and stretch yourself. This is a good thing because it'll give you a preview of the job before you're committed to it. Now, if I were in the audience hearing someone say that, I'd be thinking, this is going to be a hard conversation. I'm an introvert. I don't want to do that. I will instead just figure it out on my own, work with the guidance in this slide deck. It'll be fine. Well, here's a story from Rocky, which is the best boxing movie of all time and therefore extremely relevant to engineering. In Rocky, the protagonist, Rocky, tries to train himself and he sucks at it. And then eventually he reluctantly goes to a coach, and all of a sudden, that's when things come together. And there's the training montage and the triumphant music. So that is you, in case it was not clear in this metaphor. You are Rocky, and you need someone to make you do the uncomfortable thing. You need an accountability buddy to get you through the process. Let's get tactical about how to go about this. First, if you're at a company that has a firm idea of what they expect from a staff engineer, use that to your benefit. Read through all the supporting documentation. Take notes. In particular, pay attention to areas where the expectations don't make sense for an iOS engineer, because I promise you it was not written with iOS in mind. For instance, at my company, one of the things on the career ladder is to define technology selection processes that impact all of engineering. Now, that's very hard to do with an iOS focus. When you come across these things, try to think about how you could change them to reflect your work. So I might take that thing about impacting all of engineering and change it to be about impacting all of mobile, with an opportunity to set an example for the rest of engineering, even if I'm not directly determining their processes. Once you've digested the descriptions and noted areas to change, talk to your VP about it. Let them know that you're trying for this promotion and show them that you've understood the requirements. Make sure that they understand the nature of your iOS work and how it means you might not meet every requirement precisely. Show them you've done the work to translate it into your area. And that might be the first step of proactivity on the road to staff. When you're sure your VP understands your position and what you're looking for, put them in the driver's seat. Ask them to create a plan laying out what you need to do in order to qualify for that next level. As an example, when I last did this, I came in with a breakdown of how my current work related to the next level of the career ladder. My VP and I together identified the gaps. They thought about it and they came back to me with 6 actionable opportunities and asked me to pick 3 of them to work on. Because we had already reached a shared understanding of the role, the only work they had to do at that point was figure out the existing opportunities for the gaps we had discussed. Every engineering organization is full of opportunities because every problem is an opportunity and they're all full of problems. So that part was easy. The lesson is to make it as easy as possible for them to give you what you want. Because of institutional inertia, it'll be very tempting for your leadership to kick the can down the road. This is not malicious, it's just human nature. We prefer to avoid doing the hard thing, and that they have plenty of other stuff on their plate. So, just like with the last bullet, you're trying to make it as easy as possible for your VP to do what you want them to. So, discuss an actual calendar date for you to have accomplished your new goals and for them to create your promotion packet. This should probably be a few months before your company's next promotion cycle, but be realistic about how much work you can do in a given amount of time. You might need to plan for 12 or 18 months out instead of 6. Giving realistic guidance on schedules is an important part of every engineering job, but doing it for complicated, poorly defined work is definitely in that staff wheelhouse. So, estimating that timeline is part of your audition for the role. You're going to want to get feedback early and often. Set up a series of meetings to check in with your VP and make sure that you're on the right track. They're the one who came up with these projects, so they've got the best idea of what they're looking for. You don't want to show up in 18 months only to find out that you misunderstood the assignment. These meetings will be your opportunity to recalibrate and make sure you're still pointed the right direction. There is, of course, another reason to do this, an ulterior motive. Remember how I said that building this relationship is the most important part? Well, to do that, you need FaceTime with this person. You need to remind them that you exist, that you're engaged in this process, and that you're relying on them to work through it with you. In upper management, there's just too much going on for them to be proactive about everyone under them unless there's something on fire. Well, a recurring check in is more fun for them than having to fight a fire, so try and give them that option. Now, at this point, if you've done everything right, which is to say you understood the ladder, you made it easy for your VP to translate your work into that ladder, you checked in regularly, and of course you got the work done, then you should be looking at a promotion. If so, congratulations, you don't need to watch the rest of this. But if you're not getting the promotion, then that means somebody messed up. Check back with your notes on the process and make sure that it wasn't you. If you're convinced that you did everything right and you're seeing the goalposts move, then it might be time for the last strategy. As I said earlier, it is definitely going to be easier to get to the next level by being hired into it. Personally, I think that that's a real problem in our industry. But today I'm talking about the world as it is, not as I would like it to be. So if you don't trust that your leadership is going to help you get this promotion, or if you tried and you don't think your efforts are getting the results they deserve, then your next move is out the door. And when you're interviewing for this next job, be really careful that you're talking about the same role. There's a certain amount of title inflation in the industry, so you might see job listings for staff roles that actually just have the same senior responsibilities you're used to. That said, there's not a whole lot of strategy to figure out with this process. So instead, let's look at some of the pros and cons you might consider to help you decide if this is the right move. You are for sure going to get the title faster by leaving than any other way. You should expect to take at least a year to earn the promotion internally, but landing a new job can happen in a matter of weeks. I don't think that this is 100% an upside. As we've just been talking about, there's a ton of useful learning and growth that you go through trying to earn the promotion. But if you've done that work and you're not seeing the outcomes you want, this will certainly be more efficient. Another sad fact about the industry is that switching jobs is the best way to get a significant raise. And that's true even if you're not changing titles. Companies often have different buckets of money for new hire salaries versus raises. And for whatever reason, we tend to put a lot more weight on making new hires happy than we do on keeping existing employees happy. It sucks, but that is the reality. And knowing it, you can take advantage and ruthlessly bargain for your hiring package. Now, if you're going down this path because you tried the previous one and you didn't get what you wanted, you're probably feeling pretty burnt out. Starting at a new place will certainly bring some of that first day of school energy, and you'll get a boost from it. Now, is this better than taking some time off to address the root causes of your feelings? No, it definitely is not. But that is a point for a different talk about mental health, which is not what I'm doing right now. So, moving on. On the con side of the ledger, you will need that honeymoon energy because you're going to be going into the deep end. Like I've been saying this whole time, staff is a significantly different job. If you haven't been doing that work already, there is a learning curve. And there is also a learning curve to joining a new company. Those things are going to intersect in some difficult ways. So, as an example, if you're coming in as a staff engineer with a mandate to improve code quality, you're going to have a lot to learn before you can take any action. How does this place define code quality? What tooling is in place? Is it giving you data that you know how to use? What's even the culture around pull requests? Can you request changes on them? So this is stuff that you knew like the back of your hand at your old company, but now you're going to be in the dark for a while. If you're hired in at the staff level, you might never be promoted again. There just might not be a higher level on your new company's career ladder, but if there is, you might not be considered for it. Now, you might not care about this. You're certainly not going to be fired for not being promoted, since all levels senior and beyond are terminal. But it does mean that you might not see a significant raise or a stock grant or any other perk of promotion ever again once you're hired. So be sure that you understand the career ladder during the interview process. And you'll probably want to ask how often people actually advance beyond your new level. And leaving behind a job means leaving behind a lot of important stuff. There is, of course, the financial impact of unvested stock, if that's something your company does. But here, the equity I'm thinking about is more the sort of sweat equity that you build up just by merit of doing a job for a while. You know the people, you know how to interact with them, you know who to talk to when problems come up, and that person is you for a lot of other people at the company, which means you've got a certain level of respect and recognition. You know the code base backwards and forwards, and you have informed opinions on the business model and the product direction. Giving all this up is not the end of the world, but it'll take a while to reestablish at a new company. Let's take a step back. So far, we've been discussing this change in a strategic, value neutral way, on the assumption that you want the staff role and we need to figure out how to get it. But I would be remiss if I did not point out some downsides, which you should at least think about before you invest all of this time and effort. First off, you're not going to be coding as much. In fact, your coding time is going to be so constrained that the responsible thing to do is to take yourself off the critical path. You shouldn't be working on the most deadline critical stuff. This means two things. One, if you really love coding, you're probably not going to have as much fun on a daily basis. And two, you'll be learning more slowly, and your skills might even backslide. If you derive a lot of value from your ability to code, you'll need to find a way to keep your hand in, maybe a personal side project or something non-critical at the day job. And compared to a full-time coding job, where you know you're doing it right, if the tests pass and the app doesn't crash, the feedback loop is going to be slow and uncertain. If you're working on a project to change your interview process, for instance, like I was, you won't know if it worked until you've developed the process, you've hired some people, and you've seen how successful they are, meaning their annual review. So that's a year minimum. If you thrive on rapid feedback, you're going to need to find another place to get that satisfaction. In a proactive job, you don't necessarily know what the next thing you're working on is. This is true for every staff role, but particularly in iOS, where because that silo is smaller, you're going to have to work a little harder to find and define those opportunities. If a lot of your work is coming from projects landing on your plate, that probably means you're not extending yourself enough. It's an uncomfortable place to be. Along with those unclear responsibilities come unclear success criteria. If you're defining your own work, you're also in charge of figuring out when you've succeeded. Except not really, because there is still a VP above you who's going to tell you if you're right or if you've created another fire that they have to face. So you'll need to be sure to keep communicating and keep in sync with your leadership about what you're doing and your expected outcomes. And as we've just spent a lot of time discussing, the process of getting here isn't easy. It's time consuming. And especially if your company doesn't do this often, there'll probably be some mistakes that'll set you back. Unlike the other downsides listed on this slide, this one isn't an ongoing cost. It's just a upfront cost, unless you want to get promoted again, at which point you'll basically start the entire process over. So if you looked at that last slide and decided that it's not actually worth the pain, that's okay. There's no expectation that you go this route. Keep in mind that if you're even in a position to think about this, you're probably quite valuable to your employer. You're going to be expensive to replace, which means that it's in their best interest to keep you happy. So let's think about it. Are there other things they could give you that would make you happy? One path people often follow is oscillating back and forth from IC to manager every couple of years. This is a great compromise. You get to try out new areas and new responsibilities, but you come back to engineering often enough to keep your skills sharp. Like we talked about at the start of the talk, management has a lot of new skills to learn, but unlike staff, there's a very clear process to get there, and the responsibilities are very clearly defined and shared across the industry. You could also look for another area of responsibility that'll allow you to flex and grow your IC skill set. For instance, is there a new greenfield project coming up that you'd like to drive? Or is there an opportunity to focus deeply on infrastructure or a design system or CI, some enablement that'll help everyone you work with, some of that 10x engineering stuff? Or maybe you'd like to work more closely with your design team and become a prototype engineer. The point is, there are a lot of opportunities to add value while keeping yourself close to the code. And if the company has to choose between losing all of your output or some of it, they might let you modify your hours. You could try to use your capital to change to a 3 or 4 day a week schedule or 1 week on, 1 week off. Now, I know this sounds unlikely, but I know several engineers who've done exactly this. If you can make the case that you will accomplish a senior engineer's workload in less than full time, no one actually loses anything. You just need to get over that initial resistance of that's weird and we don't do that. All right, let's recap. Being a staff engineer is not necessary for a successful career. But if it's what you want to do, start by building a relationship with upper management. Nobody knows what the job actually is, so you can define it yourself, or you can work with your VP to define what it means at your company. Make it easy for them to give you what you want. Work to the definition you created to earn that promotion. If your company can't provide it, you can find it elsewhere, or you can find another way to be happy at your job. I hope this has been informative. Thank you for sticking with me. My email and Mastodon are in the corner of this slide. Please feel free to reach out. Again, thanks for listening.